Since long before our founding, settlers of this new world have looked out at the horizon dead west and wondered to themselves if it was possible to reach the Pacific Ocean without ever having stepped foot on land. Even after the American Revolution, when the pounding of rebellion began to die down in our ears, we too sought to make our mark on the world and be the ones to discover and own the key to the West. For many years, France held most of the land west and around the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, with Spain holding a large majority of the southwest corner. Part of that land was the port town of New Orleans, a major artery for trade along the Mississippi. During this time, the adolescent United States needed the port, but in 1802, France retracted the United States' access to the port entirely. Jefferson, who was president at the time, sent representatives over to France. They were willing to offer $10 million in exchange for French land east of the Mississippi, or to get New Orleans, even if just access to the port city. France has a couple options from here. They could either mobilize their forces and make an empire of North America, which would be devastating both financially and militarily should it fail, or they could simply sell it. So they offered $15 million for the entirety of Louisiana and complete control over New Orleans. The deal caught the American representative off guard. So caught off guard, in fact, that he immediately accepted the deal on the spot without even consulting Jefferson. On April 30th, 1803, the transaction was finalized. Back in Washington, Jefferson began to dream of a perfect expedition through his new playground. Since before the Louisiana Purchase was a twinkle in the young nation's eyes, Thomas Jefferson has been planning a large-scale scientific expedition in the North American West. Popular among the high-ups and the wealthy in the United States, the idea of Manifest Destiny was the belief that America deserved to extend its borders to reach both coasts. In order to have his scientific expedition, he would need someone to head it. For this, he turned to his close family friend and personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis. Lewis, a 28-year-old former soldier, was not the most likely choice for the job. He was an avid drinker, which led to many fights and a court-martial in 1795 following an incident where he challenged his lieutenant to a duel in a drunken stupor, and what Jefferson called, quote, an acute depression of the mind. What Lewis lacked in sobriety and confidence, he made up for in his voracious appetite for knowledge, which reflected well with Jefferson, who too sought knowledge in all its forms. Lewis began to study all around the country to prepare for the journey. He studied medicine to add to the herbal knowledge he accumulated from his mother, natural history, botany, astronomy, and navigation. In 1803, Congress approved the expedition. Lewis was given $2,500 for expenditures and was tasked with recruiting and supplies. As for a needed lieutenant, Lewis turned to his former commanding officer, William Clark. Clark had, years prior, come into command of Lewis and got him sober and into shape as a good soldier. While not quite as technically smart as Lewis, Clark was far more even-tempered and was more practically smart. Clark happily accepted the invitation. On May 14, 1804, the expedition officially set off. Lewis stayed behind for about 6 days while the rest of the expedition crawled slowly forward. On the 20th, Lewis, several officers, and some local elites joined them on horseback, which only took them an hour. The start of the trip was not without its troubles. The work was hard and the progress was slow. 5 court-martials were issued during this period, understandable given the general youth and inexperience of the men. On August 2nd, while camped at Council Bluff, located in modern-day Iron County, Missouri, 6 Otoe and Missouri Native American chiefs visited the captains. The next day, a council was held. Peace medals were exchanged, and the captains promised peace and prosperity for the tribes if they agreed to not go to war with other nations. On August 19th, Sergeant Charles Floyd fell ill, his health rapidly and drastically diminishing. Sickness was common among the men, but Floyd lost his strength almost entirely, and by the next morning, he was dead. The Corps of Discovery buried him on Floyd's Bluff, looking on across the Missouri River. Around this time, they entered the Great Plains, which brought with it a treasure trove of new plants and animals, and to the Corps' dismay, a great lack of trees. They documented several new animal and plant species previously unknown to science, including mule deer, coyotes, antelope, and a rather elusive vermin they called prairie dogs. As they went along, they visited more Native American tribes and gave them presents like medals and guns, did demonstrations of cannons and Lewis's air rifle. They also informed the natives that the land was now under the control of the United States government, which they described as their, quote, new great chief. Of course, this did not always go so easily. On September 15th, the tribe they were meeting with, the Teton Sioux, saw the wealth of the party and demanded a boat as payment for moving upriver. Clark refused, and even pulled out his sword. Luckily, a Teton chief named Black Buffalo defused the situation and allowed them to stay for another 3 days, camping at a location the Corps of Discovery called Bad Humored Island. After the near-fatal disagreement, the expedition began to make their way further northwest, staying for a while with the Arikaras. On October 24th, they arrived at their final encampment for the year, with the Hidatsa and Mandan villages. These tribes are two of the largest and most wealthy tribes, with both the French and Spanish heavily relying on their trade in the area. And for the expedition, friendly natives were just what they needed. In 1804, the winter came with a vengeance, and they needed a place to make winter encampment. So on November 2nd, the Corps of Discovery began construction on Fort Mandan. While they waited the winter out, they met a French trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau, who knew the Hidatsa language. With him was his pregnant Shoshone wife named Sacagawea, who would be indispensable because she could translate various native languages for them, and they later would need the help of the Shoshone horses. They hired Charbonneau immediately. On February 11th, Sacagawea gave birth to her son, Jean-Baptiste, who would become a source of morale for the men of the Corps. On April 7th, the boats were packed and about a dozen men were sent back downriver to Washington with artifacts, skeletons, furs, and 5 live animals. By the 29th, the party had been further west than any white man before them ever had. Throughout their journey, there was an abundance of new animals everywhere the eye could see, and they even had their first encounter with a grizzly bear. On June 1st, the Corps saw on the horizon Bearpaw Mountain, which was the first glimpse of the Rockies thus far. 2 days later, they reached what is now Decision Point. The point forked the river, and the captains agreed to split the expedition briefly to figure out which river was the Missouri. The men originally disagreed with the idea, but in a moment that showed the unity of the Corps, they agreed that no matter where the captains took them, they would follow. After about 40 miles, they agreed that the left-hand fork was the Missouri, and continued up it. On June 13th, they reached the Great Falls in modern-day Montana. The party was entranced by the serenity of the falls. Lewis described it as, quote, a truly magnificent and sublimely grand object, which from the commencement of time has been concealed from the view of civilized man. But what they failed to consider upon reaching the falls was just how they were going to get around it. They had to transport all of their equipment over 18 miles of broken, rocky path. By early July, with the crew all thoroughly exhausted, they completed their journey and celebrated Independence Day heartedly, using up the last of their whiskey. On August 11th, Luce and an advancing party came into contact with their first Shoshone, and called out to him Tababone, which Sacagawea taught him was as close a friend as they could get in the language, but actually meant stranger or enemy. The Shoshone ran off. The very next day, the party reached the Continental Divide at Lemhi Pass. Lewis hiked to the top to see what he thought would be more prairie, but instead found miles and miles more of mountain ranges. In this key moment, they realized the prospect of a Northwest Passage was impossible. But in light of this situation, on August 15th, the Corps came across a small village of Lemhi Shoshone, who greeted them affectionately. The chief agreed to go with Kamiwe and a small detachment of natives back to the camp. Amazingly, on the 17th, when they returned to the camp, Sacagawea recognized the chief as her very own brother, who she had not seen for years. From the Shoshone, they got the horses they needed for their journey. On the 31st, the expedition began to head northwards. Around this time, Clark predicted that they had traveled 4,162 miles by only dead reckoning, only 4 miles off the actual number. Food is scarce in the mountain, and their needing to butcher a horse is evident of that. On September 20th, the expedition stumbled out of the mountains and met with the Nez Perce. The Nez Perce originally intended on killing the Corps for their supplies, something that would have been an easy task against the tired and sleeping men. But an old woman named Watquis told them that the white men had been kind to her as a captive years ago, and to treat them with mercy. After following a number of different rivers and creeks, they arrived at Mount Hood, a spot on Clark's map that told them the sea was getting near. Almost a month later, they spotted what they thought was the ocean, but sadly it was just a cape. Finally, by mid-November, the expedition came in sight of where the Pacific Ocean met the mouth of the mighty Columbia River. At this point, they were left with a tough decision on where to make camp for the winter of 1805 to 1806. They could either stay with the Chinook Native Americans on the north side of the river, which would probably come with a hefty toll, or the south bank where there's plenty of elk, stay by the ocean and possibly look for ships, or head back upriver. What they decided to do was rather unprecedented. They held a vote for all the members of the expedition to decide where to camp, which included both York, Clark's black slave, and Sacagawea, a Native American woman. This is 60 years before the emancipation of slaves in the United States, and 100 years before the right for women to vote. They chose as a group to camp on the south side and construct Fort Clatsop, moving in on Christmas Day. By March, the expedition was preparing to leave, but they were running low on trade goods. On March 23rd, they left for home, and they were not delaying for much. They made it back out of the mountains by late June, and chose to split up and take different routes. By mid-August, Clark and Lewis's groups met up and continued back. 2 days later, they met back with the Mandan villages. Charbonneau and Sacagawea split with the group and headed back to Yellowstone. On September 23rd, 1806, the Corps of Discovery returned to St. Louis. Lewis made his way back to Jefferson, and while nothing was officially documented from their meeting, it is very likely they discussed the impossibility of a full water route through North America. When Lewis and Clark made their promises to the Native American people, they wholeheartedly wished those promises true. But the truth is that peace between the white man and the natives was just not possible. It has been said that the Louisiana Purchase and subsequent settlement of the American West was the ancestral ways of the Native Americans. But in the words of Gerard Baker, a Mandan Hidatsa, quote, Lewis and Clark expected, as well as the tribes did, that things would be perfect from there on in, and people would live together in harmony, and it just didn't happen. But there were times in that winter where it was beautiful.